Rabbi.
Hi, Joby. Gemar Chatima Tova.
Chatzma Tova. I have a quick question. Does one say Avinu Malkeinu if you're b'yichidut or not with a minion?
Yes, you still say Avinu Malkeinu.
Thank you.
Sure, sure. Okay, why don't we get started? It's going to be a shorter session today because I have to get to shul for the 7 o'clock slichas, which will not be the case tomorrow because it's unique to today. Okay, so we were talking about in we're in Siman Gimel in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, Sif Yud Zayin. And after discussing the responsibility on the Beis Din to establish proper weights and measures in a community, the next responsibility of a Beis Din is to make sure that there's no price fixing within the community to artificially inflate necessary commodities. And remember, this only pertains to vital commodities that are considered essential to the consumer. The three examples that the Gemara gives are wine, oil, and flour, but added to that would be bread, and in certain communities, meat or chicken, right, or eggs. Those would be considered to be essentials. Okay, so I want us to understand that the Shulchan Aruch says, based on the Gemara, that you're only allowed to make a 1/6, or what we established was really 1/5, or 20% profit, um, and we're going to qualify that even further depending upon whether or not you have additional expenses in bringing these commodities to market. But as far as your net profit, on certain essential items, you're only allowed to make a net 20%. So I want us to understand that this is not the same halacha as onah. We had started saying that, but if you take a look at the Imrei Yaakov on in Sifkat and Nun Ches, he states as follows: V'chol hamafkia hashar. So first of all, we had started by saying last time on Thursday that if a person artificially inflates the prices of these essentials, then he's in violation of the law of v'chei achicha imach, that you have to make sure that your brother lives with you in society, which means that if you impoverish him because you inflate the prices of essentials and he becomes penniless as a result, you're not fulfilling that mitzvah to sustain your brother within society. And obviously, of course, just like the law of the Cheyachicha Imach is written by the law of not charging interest on loans, it therefore only applies to your Jewish brother. It does not apply to a non-Jew. In a non-Jewish world, if your customers are primarily non-Jews, so that this restriction doesn't exist. But obviously, there may be additional restrictions based on governmental laws or based upon just rules of ethics that are established by the standards of the society in which you live. So he writes as follows. He says, Da de iser havkas hashar mayri afilu ba'ofen deleka bo iser ona. He says this law, even though it has the same percentages as the laws of ona, it's completely different from the law of ona, meaning that even when there's no ona involved, kagon, de mefarish lokona da'af shesha v'kach v'kach mikol makom eini chafetz limkor ela v'kach v'kach. He says, let's say you are you divulge complete information to the buyer, and you tell him, listen, I want you to know that I'm making a 25% profit on this. It cost me this, and I'm charging this, and I'm entitled to charge it because I want to make a higher profit. So we know that in the laws of ona'ah, as long as you give full disclosure to your customer, there's no prohibition of ona'ah, right? Remember we said that debazeni spar le'el simin beis sif gimel deleka mishum ona'ah sham, right? But mikol makam. So therefore, like if I tell you that this rocking chair that I'm selling at my garage sale, only I bought it at IKEA for $10, but I'm selling it for $20. As long as you tell a person, you give him full disclosure, you can charge whatever you want, and there's no ona. Mikol makom yesh iser shel havkas ashar. But if you're selling essential items, you're selling oil and things like that. So even with full disclosure, where there's no iser ona, there's still an iser called havkas ashar, which is price fixing. V'chein im hu mocher b'makom deleka od mocher macher me'osa schora ve'ein sham mechir kavua. Dinomar shim lokach yoser over mishumona. And similarly, let's say you have a corner on the market. So there is no fixed index price on a certain commodity. Because let's say you live in an area in the middle of nowhere, and there is no other, there's no index, there's no fixed price, in which case there's no law of Ona. And it's just a question of how much do I get to profit on something that, let's say, cost me X. How much more than X am I allowed to charge? Well, if it's an essential commodity, the laws of Ona may not apply because there's no fixed price on this in the rest of society. But mikol makom im hu lokeach yoser mima shechazal hirutiru lakachas, dahainu b'chayin nefesh yoser mishtus ofer mishom hafkas ashar. Nonetheless, you could still be in violation of what's called hafkas ashar, price fixing, because you're artificially inflating the price of an essential commodity. So this is a completely separate halacha from the laws of Onah. What I also wanted to show you today is, before we go any further in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, I wanted to show you the Aruch HaShulchan, which is composed at the turn of the 20th century, and it provides us with, I think, a little bit better snapshot of what's going on, at least in the turn of the 20th century in Europe. So the Aruch HaShulchan writes as follows. Let me just make sure that I can share it with you. Okay. Does everyone see this new screen? Okay, so the Aruch HaShulchan writes as follows: Kishem shechayavim beit din laha'amid memuna al hamidos v'hamishkalos kishiyesh yicholos biyadam kemo shekasafti b'sif gimel. Just like as we wrote above, that when the Beis Din has the ability to do so, they must appoint officers who will monitor the implementation of proper weights and measures. Kemo chen chayavin lahamid memunim al hamekachim shelo ya'alu yoter midai. They are also obligated to appoint officers to make sure that people are not inflating prices. Ve'ein lo la'adam laharviach bidvarim sheyesh behem chayei nefesh. And therefore a person is not really allowed to garner excessive profit on essential commodities, kemo yenos shmane muslato, such as wine, oil, and flour. I don't know, by the way, whether wine would apply today. I don't think that wine is considered an essential commodity. I guess it depends who you ask. Certainly in my house, it's not an essential commodity. Maybe grape juice. The kol shekain, lechem ubasar, but certainly essential commodities would also include bread and meat. The chayotze bahem, and these are examples. He says, yoter mishtut. You're not allowed to charge more than a sixth, which we established is using the mathematics of the times of the Talmud, which really turns out to be a fifth, which is 20%. Bamed dvarim amurim, b'socher shemocher scharaso harbe biyachad below torach. But this prohibition of not making more than 20% on your gross cost is only when you're selling it without additional costs, because you're selling in large quantities. Let's say you have like one of those big warehouse stores, or you're selling it out of your barn. Avol chen v'ni hamocher ma'at ma'at, but if a storekeeper, who's a retailer, sells in small commodities, shamin lo yitziyosav al hachanus v'gam schar tirchaso, he's allowed to factor in his net costs, such as the cost of maintaining a store or paying rent, and also his labor he's allowed to factor in as well. V'nosaf al zeh yarviach shtus. And then once you've factored in all of his labor costs and his rent and all his overhead, so then he's not allowed to make more than 20% on his net cost. Bamed dvarim amurim kishelo hukar hashar. But that's only true if the market price is not already inflated. He's not allowed to contribute to the inflation of the price. But let's say, even before he came to market, there was already an inflated price on these commodities. So then, avolim hukar hashar yimkar kefi hayoker af sheyesh lo schora mezumenes misha'as hazol. He says if the price is already shot up, then he's allowed to stay in step with what the rest of the market is charging. Because let's say the illustration that the Aruch HaShulchan gives is as follows. Let's say I have a commodity like soybeans or wheat or something like that I purchased a lot and I have now in my silo. I have a huge amount of this commodity that I bought when the prices were low, and it's an essential commodity. And now there is a shortage on this commodity, and so the market price has shot up. So I'm allowed to charge whatever the current market value is, even though I'm making more than 20% profit. And the reason is because I'm not inflating the price. I'm just keeping up with market value. The kol zeh eino ela kishiyesh biyad based in lahachriach lechol hamochim shebeir limkor kain. And then he gives another qualification. He says this halacha is only true that a person is not allowed to charge more than 20% profit on his net costs is when the Beis Din has the power to control the all of the sellers in the community. Aval kishiyesh mochrim shelo yitzaisu lazeh ve'ein biyacholes lahachricham. But let's say you live in a community where not all of the sellers, let's say it's even a Jewish community, but not all the sellers are going to conform to the wishes of the Beis Din, and there's no way that we can compel them because the government doesn't give Beis Din that authority. Ein machrichim gam es hayechidim hashoimim. He says then it's not appropriate to make a policy where only individual God-fearing merchants are going to abide by the price fixing. In other words, the rabbis can't come in and say, we are forcing our sellers in the frum community to lower their prices if everyone else in that society is not going to listen. And the reason his argument is the lama yafsidum bechinam. He says, why should we cause these God-fearing sellers to lose money unnecessarily? It's not fair. In other words, everyone else is charging, let's say, 25% profit margin. And so the rabbis say, you know what, we want to give a break to the consumer, so we're going to tell only the frum merchants who will listen to us, lower your margins to 20%. So the Aruch HaShulchan already is living in a free enterprise society, and he's saying it's that kind of social engineering is not within the purview of the rabbis, because they can't control the market price in general, they should not place this oppressive policy on just the frum Jews in the community. This is what's going to cause a rebellion, by the way, against the rabbinic community, is if they see that based upon, compared to what everyone else is charging, they're being forced to charge less. And that's going to break the back of the community, and it eventually will cause a revolt. I just want you to know that this whole idea of the rabbinic community fixing an index or a price on what people can charge is really what broke the back of, similarly, it's what broke the back of the chief rabbinate of the United States. Did you all know that at one time there was a chief rabbinate of the United States? Did anyone know that? It only lasted a couple of years in the first decade of the 1900s. The first and last chief rabbi of the United States was Rabbi Yaakov Yosef. Anyone ever hear of the yeshiva RJJ, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, or the RJJ Journal? So that's named after Rabbi Yaakov Yosef. He was a great scholar, a brilliant Talmudist, and he was brought in from Europe to be the chief rabbi of New York, and by default the chief rabbi of the United States. And things were going great until he decided that he would charge a penny tax on meat, which was the practice in the Jewish communities of Poland and Russia, where in order to maintain the Jewish infrastructure of the shtetelach, of the Jewish communities, the Beis Din, the Batei Din of those communities would charge a penny tax. In other words, if I'm paying 50 cents a pound for meat, they would charge 51 cents, and for every pound of meat they sell, they give 1 penny to the Beis Din, and the Beis Din uses that money to build the mikvaos and to maintain the infrastructure of the Jewish community, to pay the rabbis and so forth. Okay, that it seems pretty innocent, right? But guess what? New York City in the early 1900s was a melting pot. And so the Hungarians didn't want to abide by what the Ukrainians said, and the Ukrainians didn't want to abide by the Hungarians. And there was just a flat-out refusal of by the butchers to abide by this kind of what they perceived to be onerous taxation in a free enterprise system. And as a result, they just flat out refused, and there were, protests against the chief rabbi, and it basically broke the back of the institution, which is why to this day there is no chief rabbi of the United States, and I guess by extension no chief rabbi of Canada either. But that's the history of it, and it just never, the idea of a chief rabbinate just never was able to recover because of sort of the independent spirit of the Western Hemisphere. You go out west and you do whatever you want. That was the attitude. So it's very important to know that this whole concept of the rabbinate controlling what people charge and what they don't charge really doesn't work in our communities. And essentially, you're already beginning to sense that from the Aruch HaShulchan, who's at the turn of the 20th century. In Europe already, it's starting not to work, where he says that, if you live in a Jewish city, even if the majority of the merchants are Jewish, but the Beis Din is not able to influence every single merchant to abide by their edicts, then it's not right to compel the frum ones who are God-fearing Jews to tell them that they have to lower their prices. Umihu, im ha-Beis Din yodim shal yedei kein yuchrachu gam ha'acherim likbar kemohem, yachrichu lahashomin. Nearly, he says, however, let's say the Beis Din is of the opinion that by telling the conforming merchants that they should lower their prices, then this will force the market to have lower prices. In other words, if they feel that this is possible, obviously they have to assess the situation. Let's say half the merchants in the city are frum and half the merchants in the city are not going to listen to the Beis Din. But so their calculus is, well, if we make all of the frum merchants lower their prices on an essential commodity, then we're going to force the non-frum merchants who don't listen to us, they're going to be forced to lower their prices, otherwise they won't be able to compete, because everyone's going to start patronizing the frum merchants. So if that's their calculus, then they would be allowed to do that. But he says, ironically, in our countries, in our cities, in Europe, nowadays, at the turn of the 20th century, he says the problem is just the opposite. Why? What's the problem? Because sellers are trying to undercut each other, and everyone's making what they call a razor-thin profit margin, and merchants are being forced to impoverish themselves because they can't make adequate profit. He says, what we have today is we have truly a free enterprise system where everyone's trying to undercut the other. He says, and this is causing a breakage of the entire system, where people are being forced into poverty because they simply can't make enough profit in order to feed their families. Now, in other words, many times it's a very delicate system, the economic system. Sometimes the consumer is exploited, and sometimes the seller is exploited because everyone's trying to undercut the other. V'harei Chazal hitiru laharviach shtus af ba'ochel nefesh v'kol sheken b'sharim minei scharos shetzrichim laharviach harbe yoser. He says, and our sages tell you, you're entitled to make a 20% profit even on essential items. And certainly on the non-essential items, you're certainly entitled to make a profit. Today you look at the products that are placed in the supermarket. Every person who works in a supermarket will tell you that the profit margins are razor thin. And so they have to, it's a constant game of trying to raise the price of one commodity so that you can lower the price of another commodity so that eventually you end up making a small profit. And it's based on volume. It's not based on, because that's how the supermarket model works, is based purely on volume. Because if they had to, no one's making 20% profit, or it's very, very rare. Ve'ata mizalzalim b'mekchim below das u'below tvuna. And he says, and therefore today prices are cut and slashed without even any discrimination or consideration to the welfare of those who are in this business. V'yesh mi shechalak kol hascharos legimel chalakim. He says, and there are those who divide merchandise into three categories. Diba'ochel nefesh maskir madshtus v'lo yoser. That when it comes to commodities that are consumables, that are food items, you can charge up to 20% but not more, 20% over your net but not more. V'she'ein bahem ochel nefesh klal yuchlu la'arviach afilu b'kefel. That when it comes to non-commodities, where it's not a consumable item, so then you're allowed to make up to 100% profit. And when it comes to things that help you prepare food items, but themselves they are not themselves essential food items, such as spices, yarvichu echad be'echad v'lo yoser, then you can make 100%. So I'm not sure. He says non-food items you can even make 200% profit, but with food items that are non-essentials like spices, you can profit up to 100%. All right, we're going to have to hold it here for today, but there's a lot more to discuss. So have a good day. Gemar Chasima Tov, everybody. We'll see you, Mir Hashem, tomorrow.